Some men spend their whole lives searching for home, only to find it in the most broken places. At 65, Frank Colton had nothing but worn hands and a stubborn old donkey named Nellie until he bought a crumbling stone house for just $1. The locals called it cursed. Frank just needed walls. But when Nellie wouldn't stop pawing at the back wall one morning, everything changed. Behind those stones lay a fortune hidden for 200 years, gold coins, trinkets, and letters from a family that fled Spanish soldiers in 1821. What would you do if your last chance at belonging came with a secret that could change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Colton had been a ranch hand for 43 years, and in that time he'd learned that the best way to live was to keep moving. Stay too long in one place and people started asking questions. They wanted to know about family, about plans, about why a man his age was still drifting from spread to spread like tumbleweeds in a desert wind. Frank had no good answers for those questions, so he'd learned to leave before they got asked. The old brass bell on Nellie's collar was the only sound that had followed him through all those years. He'd found her at an auction in Alamogordo when she was just a foal, her mother dead from complications. Nobody wanted an orphaned donkey. Frank paid $15 and figured she'd be gone within a year. That was 12 years ago. The bell had been around her neck when he bought her tarnished, dented, but still capable of producing a clear, lonely note that cut through the desert silence. He'd never taken it off. They'd worked together on ranches across New Mexico, into West Texas, up through Colorado, one winter that nearly killed them both. Nellie carried his bedroll and his few possessions. She ate what he ate. When times were lean, she stood outside bunkhouses while Frank slept, and somehow her presence made him feel less like he was disappearing into nothing. People said you couldn't count on a donkey the way you could a horse, but those people hadn't met Nellie. She'd saved his life twice, once from a rattlesnake he hadn't seen, once from a fall into a ravine when she refused to follow him down a trail that looked solid but wasn't. The thing about Frank was this: he'd never been afraid of hard work, but he'd always been terrified of staying still. His father had stayed still, worked the same ranch for 37 years until his heart gave out in the middle of branding season. His mother had stayed still in that little house in Roswell until she couldn't remember her own name anymore. Frank had watched both of them fade into the background of their own lives, becoming part of the landscape, indistinguishable from the fence posts and barn boards. He'd sworn he wouldn't let that happen to him. But 65 was different from 35, and Frank's body had started reminding him of that fact every morning. His left knee wouldn't bend right anymore. His hands ached in the cold, the joints swollen and stiff. He'd developed a cough last winter that still hadn't fully gone away. The young ranch hands looked through him now instead of at him, and the ranch owners hired him more out of pity than need. He could feel himself becoming invisible, and that scared him more than staying still ever had. So when he saw the advertisement tacked to the bulletin board at the feed store in Esperanza Springs, historic stone house as is, make offer, he'd stopped to read it. Not because he wanted a house, but because the word historic seemed like a joke in a town where half the buildings were already falling down. Esperanza Springs had 847 residents, down from 1,210 years ago. It sat 35 miles from anywhere that mattered, connected to the rest of the world by a 2-lane highway that most people used to drive around it, not through it. The downtown consisted of one block of failing businesses, a general store that still had Christmas decorations from 2015, a diner that was only open 4 days a week, a hardware store run by a man in his 80s who dozed behind the counter most afternoons. There was a Catholic church built in 1887 that listed badly to the left, a Baptist church that had closed 3 years ago, and a cemetery that was better maintained than most of the houses. Frank had been working at the Triple K ranch just outside town for 6 months when he saw the advertisement. The ranch was small, barely profitable, run by a widow who couldn't afford to pay much, but provided meals and a dry place to sleep. It wasn't the worst situation he'd been in, but it wasn't home either. Nothing had ever been home. He'd called the number on the advertisement more out of curiosity than anything else. A man named Carl Morrison answered, his voice rough with age and cigarettes. "You interested in that old death trap?" he'd asked. "Maybe," Frank had said. "How much? How much you got?" Frank had thought about the $347 in his savings account, the sum total of 43 years of wages after food and necessities. "Not much," Carl had laughed, a sound like gravel in a bucket. "Tell you what, you give me $1 and promise to fix the roof before it crushes somebody, and it's yours. Nobody else is fool enough to take it." Frank had driven out to see the property the next day. The house sat 3 miles outside town on 30 acres of desert scrub and rocks. It was Spanish colonial style, built sometime in the early 1800s according to Carl, made of stone quarried from the surrounding hills. The walls were 3 feet thick, you could still see that much. What you couldn't see was much of anything else that resembled a house. Half the roof was missing, the windows were empty frames. The door hung from one hinge. Desert plants had invaded the interior, pushing up through the wooden floorboards that hadn't already rotted away. It was a disaster. It was perfect. Frank had walked through the rooms, or what remained of rooms, with Nellie following close behind. The main room still had its ceiling, though stained and sagging. A fireplace dominated one wall, the stones blackened with soot from fires decades old. 2 smaller rooms branched off from the main one, both completely exposed to the sky. The back wall of the house was the most intact, facing away from the prevailing winds. He'd stood in the center of what had once been someone's home and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not exactly peace, but maybe the absence of restlessness. The silence was complete, except for Nellie's bell. No sounds of ranch hands arguing, no trucks rumbling past, no foreman shouting instructions. Just wind and silence and stone walls that had stood for 200 years. "I'll take it," he'd told Carl, handing over a single wrinkled dollar bill. Carl had pocketed the money and shaken his hand. "You're crazier than I thought, but it's yours. Town clerk has the deed. Place has been in my family since the 30s, but it's been falling apart since before I was born. My grandfather used to tell stories about it being cursed, but I figure that's just because nobody wanted to put in the work to fix it up." "What kind of curse?" Frank had asked. Carl had shrugged. "The kind old men tell to scare kids away from dangerous buildings. You believe in that sort of thing?" "No," Frank had said, which was true. He believed in worn-out bodies and bad luck and running out of time, but not in curses. Frank moved into the house the following week, such as it was. He set up a camping cot in the main room and hung a tarp over the saggy ceiling to keep the rain off. He bought lumber and nails with money from his last paycheck and started the slow process of making the place habitable. He wasn't sure why he was doing it, exactly. Maybe because it was something to do. Maybe because he was tired of sleeping in other people's bunkhouses. Maybe because 65 felt like last chance territory, and this broken house was all he could afford. The people of Esperanza Springs watched him with a mix of suspicion and pity. The woman at the general store took his money without conversation. The man at the hardware store asked no questions about what he was building. At the diner, people would glance up when he entered, then look away quickly, back to their eggs and coffee and conversations that didn't include him. Frank didn't mind. He'd spent most of his life being forgettable, and he'd gotten good at it. He bought his supplies, nodded politely, and left. He had Nellie, and that was enough. More than enough, really. His days fell into a rhythm. Wake at sunrise, make coffee over a camp stove, walk the property with Nellie while the air was still cool, work on the house until the afternoon heat became unbearable, rest in the shade, work again until sunset, cook a simple meal, sit on the front step, if you could call it that, and watch the stars come out. The stars were the same here as they'd been everywhere else he'd lived, but somehow they looked different. Maybe because these walls around him, broken as they were, belonged to him. 3 weeks into his residence, Frank had repaired most of the roof over the main room and one of the smaller side rooms. He'd cleared out the dead plants and animal nests. He'd reinforced the door frame and hung a proper door he'd bought, used from the hardware store. The place was starting to look less like a ruin and more like a very rough shelter, which was about all he'd hoped for. That's when Nellie started acting strange. At first, Frank thought she was sick. She wouldn't eat her morning feed. She paced in circles around the house, instead of wandering off to forage like she usually did. She kept returning to the back wall of the main room, the one that faced away from the prevailing winds, the one that was most intact. She'd stand there, ears forward, absolutely still, then suddenly paw at the stones near the base. "What's gotten into you?" Frank asked her on the third day of this behavior. She just looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes and pawed at the wall again. Frank examined the wall. It looked the same as it always had, solid, ancient, undisturbed. The mortar between the stones was old but intact. There was nothing unusual about it that he could see. Maybe there was a snake or a rodent nest behind it, though the wall was so thick he couldn't imagine how anything could get in there. He went back to his work, but Nellie wouldn't leave the wall alone. She stood there all day, occasionally pawing, occasionally letting out a low bray that sounded almost frustrated. By evening, Frank was getting concerned. Nellie was 12 years old, which was getting up there, for a working donkey. Maybe she was developing some kind of mental problem, the way old dogs sometimes did. That night, lying on his cot, Frank listened to Nellie moving around outside. She hadn't settled down the way she normally did. He could hear her bell, restless and insistent. Around midnight, she started braying a sound she almost never made except in distress. Frank got up, pulled on his boots, and went outside with his flashlight. Nellie was standing at the back wall again, pawing at the stones, her whole body tense with what looked like determination. "All right," Frank said, running his hand down her neck. "All right, old girl, I'll take a look." He went back inside, brought out his toolbox, and approached the wall where Nellie had been focused. He ran his hands over the stones, feeling for anything unusual. At first, there was nothing. Then, near the base, he felt a slight difference in the mortar. It was harder, newer somehow, though still old by any normal standard. It had been patched, he realized. Someone had opened this wall and sealed it back up, and they'd done a decent job, but not a perfect one. Frank looked at Nellie. She was watching him intently, ears forward, absolutely still. "You're crazy, you know that?" he told her, but he reached for his pry bar anyway. The first stone came loose, easier than Frank expected. Behind it was darkness and a smell of old dust, undisturbed air, something else he couldn't quite identify. Leather, maybe, or old paper. He wedged the pry bar in deeper and worked another stone free. Then another. Nellie stood perfectly still now, watching. The night was quiet, except for the sound of stone scraping against stone and Frank's breathing, which had gotten heavier. His hands were shaking slightly, though he couldn't say why. He'd never been a man given to excitement, but something about the way the darkness opened up behind the stones made his heart beat faster. After removing 6 stones, he'd created an opening about 2 feet wide. He aimed his flashlight into the gap and leaned forward. The cavity was larger than he'd expected, maybe 4 feet deep, extending into the thickness of the wall. And it wasn't empty. At first, the flashlight beam just caught dust particles suspended in air that hadn't moved in how long. Then the beam found metal, and the metal caught the light and threw it back in a way that made Frank's breath stop in his throat. Gold. It was unmistakably gold. He reached in carefully, half expecting his hand to pass through a mirage, but his fingers touched something solid. He pulled out a coin, heavy and warm in his palm. Even covered in dust, he could see the craftsmanship, the detailed stamping, the Spanish royal seal, the date, 1821. Frank sat back on his heels, the coin resting in his palm, his mind struggling to catch up with what he was seeing. He reached in again. Another coin, then another. He found a leather pouch and pulled it out. Gently, it nearly disintegrated in his hands, but inside were more coins. Silver, this time, and something else, small carved figures, wooden, smooth with age. He kept pulling items out, laying them on the ground beside him as carefully as if they were alive. More coins. A wooden cross, intricately carved with vines and flowers, small enough to fit in a pocket. Metal implements he couldn't identify. A small, leather-bound book, the pages brittle and yellowed. And at the back of the cavity, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived the centuries, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. When he finally stopped, when the cavity was empty and everything lay spread out on the ground in the flashlight beam, Frank just stared. He'd been a poor man his entire life. Not desperately poor, he'd always had enough to eat, enough to get by, but poor in the way that means you never have anything extra, never have a cushion, never have security. He'd never even allowed himself to think about what it would be like to have real money, the kind that changed things. And here it was, pulled from a wall in a house he'd bought for $1. Nellie walked over and nuzzled his shoulder, her way of saying she'd told him so. Frank reached up and scratched behind her ears, his hand still shaking. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You were right, old girl. You were right." He spent the next hour examining each item carefully, trying not to damage anything. The coins were the most obvious treasure. He counted 47 gold pieces and 32 silver. He had no idea what they were worth, but he knew it was substantial. The carved wooden items fascinated him. Someone had put real skill into making them. The cross especially was beautiful, the kind of thing you'd make for someone you loved. But it was the letters that drew him most. He opened the oiled cloth carefully, afraid the bundle would fall apart, but whoever had wrapped them had known what they were doing. The cloth had protected them. The ribbon was silk, he realized, faded to almost nothing but still holding the letters together. He untied the ribbon with trembling fingers and unfolded the first letter. The paper was fragile, the ink faded but readable. The handwriting was elegant, educated, and the language was Spanish, which Frank could read well enough, having worked alongside Mexican ranch hands most of his life. The letter was dated the 15th of March, 1821, and it began, "Querida familia," dear family. Frank read slowly, his flashlight beam steady on the page. The writer was explaining their situation, how they'd had to leave their home quickly, how they'd hidden the family valuables in this house that belonged to a friend, how they hoped to return soon. The tone was urgent but hopeful. They believed this was temporary. They believed they'd be back. The signature at the bottom read, "Diego Mendoza." Frank read through 3 more letters by flashlight, then forced himself to stop. His eyes were tired, and the letters deserved better than to be read in darkness on the dusty ground. He carefully rewrapped the bundle in the oiled cloth and gathered everything else into his arms. He carried it all inside, set it on the small table he'd built from scrap lumber, and just looked at it. The sun was starting to come up, he realized. He'd spent the entire night digging into that wall. Nellie wandered in through the open door and stood beside him, as if to confirm that yes, all of this was real. "Familia Mendoza," Frank said out loud, testing the words. "Who were you?" The letters would tell him. He knew. But right now, standing in the grey light of dawn, surrounded by objects that had waited 200 years in darkness, Frank felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt responsible. These weren't just valuable objects. They were someone's history, someone's hope. Diego Mendoza had hidden these things, believing he'd return for them. The fact that they were still here meant he never had. What had happened to him? To his family? Had they died? Had they been captured? Frank sat down heavily on his cot, suddenly exhausted. Nellie came over and rested her head against his knee. He stroked her neck, feeling the warmth of her, the solidness of her presence. "What am I supposed to do with this?" he asked her. She didn't answer, of course, but her eyes were calm, patient, the way they always were when Frank was working through a problem. The smart thing would be to report it, call someone, the police maybe, or a museum. tell them what he'd found, and let them figure it out. But something held him back from that immediate decision. Maybe it was the way Diego's handwriting looked in those letters, full of hope and faith. Maybe it was the wooden cross, carved with such care. Maybe it was just that Frank had spent his whole life having nothing of his own, and now he had something, even if that something wasn't really his. He needed to think. He needed to understand what he'd found before he decided what to do with it. The letters would help. If he could read through them all, piece together the story of the Mendoza family, maybe he'd know what the right thing to do was. Frank looked at the wooden cross, sitting on the table among the coins and carved figures. He picked it up, felt its weight, ran his thumb over the carved vines. Someone had made this with their hands, had probably carried it with them, had hidden it here, thinking they'd hold it again. He slipped it into his shirt pocket, over his heart. He wasn't sure why, but it felt right to keep it close. Maybe because it seemed like the least valuable thing in the cache, worth nothing in money but everything in meaning. Maybe because he needed to feel connected to whoever had carved it, to remember that these weren't just objects, they were remnants of lives lived, hopes held, fears endured. The sun was fully up now, streaming through the gaps in the walls, turning the dust motes golden. Frank looked at the treasure spread across his table, at Nellie standing patient beside him, at the walls of the house that had kept these secrets for 2 centuries. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's figure out who you were, Familia Mendoza. Let's figure out what happened to you." Outside, the desert was waking up. The air was still cool, the light still soft. In a few hours, the heat would be unbearable. But right now, in this moment, Frank Colton, who had never had a home, never had anything of value, never had a purpose, beyond the next day's work, sat in his broken stone house with a fortune at his fingertips, and felt, for the first time in his 65 years, like he might actually matter to someone, even if that someone had been dead for 200 years. Frank didn't leave the house for 2 days. He told himself he was being thorough, cataloguing everything carefully before deciding on next steps. But the truth was simpler. He didn't want to share this yet. Not with the suspicious townspeople, not with authorities, not with anyone. He wanted time to understand what he'd found, and more than that, he wanted time with the Mendoza family, because that's what they'd become to him already. Not historical figures, not names on old letters, but people. Real people who'd lived and hoped and hidden their precious things in a wall with the faith that they'd return. He made a careful inventory in a notebook he'd bought months ago and never used. 47 gold coins, various denominations, 32 silver pieces, a dozen carved wooden figures, saints, he realized, religious items, the wooden cross, 3 metal implements that looked like they might be for candle making, a rosary with jade beads, the leather-bound book, which turned out to be a prayer book with handwritten notes in the margins, and the letters, 23 of them in total, spanning from March 1821 to June of the same year. But it was the cross that Frank kept returning to. He'd set it on the table with everything else, but he found himself picking it up throughout the day, turning it in his hands, studying the craftsmanship. The vines and flowers carved into the wood weren't just decorative, they were specific. Desert flowers, he realized. Prickly pear blooms, yucca. Someone who knew this landscape had carved this, someone who'd seen these plants and thought them beautiful enough to preserve in wood. The detail was extraordinary. You could see individual petals, the curve of thorns, the way the vines wound around each other. It would have taken hours to carve, probably by candlelight, given when it was made. Frank imagined a man sitting in this very house, knife in hand, wood shavings at his feet, carefully cutting away everything that wasn't this small, perfect cross. Diego, it had to be Diego who'd made it. The letters were written by someone named Maria, Diego's wife, Frank, gathered from the content. The handwriting was different, more flowing, though no less careful. But the cross spoke of a man's hands, patient hands, skilled hands, hands that worked. Frank understood that kind of work. He'd spent his life with his hands, fixing fences, mending tack, building corrals, patching roofs. There was something meditative about it, the way your mind could wander while your hands stayed busy. He imagined Diego feeling the same way, finding peace in the repetitive motion of carving, finding hope in creating something beautiful in a time of fear. He started reading the letters in chronological order, slowly, making notes of important details. The story that emerged was both simple and heartbreaking. The Mendoza family had lived in a larger town to the south. Frank couldn't quite make out the name from Maria's handwriting. Diego had been a merchant, moderately successful, with a shop that sold imported goods. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, ages ranging from 6 to 12. They'd been prosperous enough, respected in their community, active in their church. Then the independence movement had reached their town. Diego, according to Maria's letters, had supported the rebels not actively, not with weapons, but with money and shelter. When royalist soldiers began rounding up suspected sympathizers, friends warned the family to run. They'd left in the middle of the night with whatever they could carry, leaving behind everything else they owned. This house had belonged to a friend, someone Diego trusted. The letters didn't name the friend, but they made it clear this was meant to be a temporary refuge. Diego had hidden their valuables in the wall, planning to retrieve them once it was safe to return. The letters tracked their time here, the fear, the boredom, the children's restlessness, Maria's attempts to maintain some normalcy through daily prayers and lessons. The later letters showed growing desperation. Food was running low. Diego had ventured into Esperanza Springs for supplies and returned with news that soldiers were still searching. One letter mentioned a close call. Soldiers had come through town asking questions. Another mentioned Diego's growing conviction that they needed to move again, head further north, maybe into territories the Spanish crown cared less about controlling. The last letter was dated the 18th of June, 1821. It was shorter than the others, hurried, and Maria's handwriting was shakier. She wrote about Diego preparing for another scouting trip, about praying for guidance, about her fears for the children. The letter ended mid-sentence, as if she'd been interrupted and never came back to finish it. Frank read that final incomplete sentence 3 times. "If we do not return for these items, may whoever finds them." That was it. Whatever Maria had meant to say, whatever blessing or instruction or hope she'd wanted to leave, it was lost. Frank stared at those unfinished words and felt his throat tighten. They hadn't come back. Whatever happened on that scouting trip, or in the days after, the Mendoza family had never returned to retrieve their treasure. He set the letter down carefully and picked up the cross again. The wood was warm from his hands, smooth from 2 centuries of age. Diego had carved this. Maria had written those letters. The children whose names appeared throughout the correspondence, Miguel, Tomas, and little Isabella, had lived in this house, probably played in these rooms, probably touched these very walls. And then they'd vanished from history, leaving behind only these objects and these incomplete letters. Frank found himself thinking about his own life, the decades of drifting, the deliberate choice to remain unattached. The Mendoza family hadn't chosen to leave their things behind. They'd been forced out by circumstances beyond their control, had hidden their treasure with every intention of reclaiming it. But Frank had spent 43 years making sure he'd never have anything worth coming back for. The parallel was uncomfortable. He stood up, needing to move, and walked to the back wall where he'd found the cavity. The stones were still piled nearby, waiting to be replaced. He'd have to seal it back up eventually, but not yet. Right now, it felt important to leave it open, like a wound that hadn't finished speaking. Nellie came up beside him and rested her head against his shoulder. He reached up to scratch behind her ears, and his fingers brushed against her bell, that old, tarnished bell that had been with them both for 12 years. They had faith, he said to her quietly. The Mendozas. They believed they'd come back. They believed things would work out. Nellie just breathed, steady and calm. Frank pulled the cross from his pocket and looked at it again in the afternoon light. The carved flowers seemed even more delicate now that he knew the story behind them. This hadn't been just an object to Diego. It had been a prayer carved in wood, a hope made tangible, something to hold on to when everything else was falling apart. He understood that now, and understanding it changed something in him, though he couldn't quite name what. He slipped the cross back into his pocket, over his heart, and made a decision. He wouldn't call the authorities yet. He wouldn't report this to anyone. First, he would try to find out what happened to the Mendoza family. They deserved that much to have their story known, to have someone bear witness to their hope and their loss. And maybe, in finding their story, Frank would finally understand what he was supposed to do with the fortune they'd left behind. On the third day, while carefully examining the oiled cloth that had protected the letters, Frank found something he'd missed initially. Tucked beneath the bundle, wrapped in a separate piece of leather, was another book, smaller than the prayer book, bound in dark leather, that had survived remarkably well. He opened it carefully and realized what he was holding: a journal, Maria's journal. The first few pages were dated years before the letters, back when their life had been ordinary. Recipes were written in neat columns, alongside household accounts and notes about the children's education. It was the mundane record of a comfortable life, the kind of details that usually disappear without trace. Frank read about Miguel's progress with mathematics, about Isabella's singing voice, about Tomas's fascination with insects. He read Maria's recipe for pan de muerto and her notes on preserving summer fruit. Then the entries changed. The handwriting remained the same, but the content shifted from domestic routines to barely concealed fear. Maria wrote about neighbors disappearing, about soldiers in the plaza, about conversations Diego had late at night with other men whose names she didn't record. She wrote about preparing to leave, about what they could carry, and what they'd have to abandon. Frank read about their last day in their real home, how Maria had walked through each room, saying goodbye to walls and furniture and the life they'd built. How she'd wrapped her grandmother's silver candlesticks and buried them in the garden, hoping somehow to return. How she'd packed the children's favorite things: Miguel's wooden horse, Isabella's doll, Tomas's collection of interesting rocks. The entries written from this house were different still. Shorter, sometimes just a few sentences. Maria wrote about the fear of discovery, about running out of soap, about teaching the children to stay quiet when strangers passed on the road. She wrote about Diego's growing tension, his silences, the way he'd stand at the window for hours watching for dust clouds that might mean soldiers approaching. But woven through the fear were moments of tenderness that made Frank's chest ache. Maria described Isabella singing softly to her doll at night. She wrote about Miguel, trying to be brave, trying to act older than his 12 years. She mentioned Tomas, finding a family of lizards outside and watching them with such focused joy that for a moment they could all pretend this was just an adventure. And she wrote about Diego carving. "He sits by candlelight," one entry read, "and his hands are steady even when mine shake. He is making something for me, though he pretends I cannot see. A cross, I think. He says we must have faith that God sees us, even in hiding. I try to have that faith. Some days it is easier than others." Frank set the journal down and looked at the cross in his hand. Diego had made it for Maria. Not for himself, but for his wife, to give her something to hold on to when faith was hard. The thought sat in Frank's chest like a stone, heavy and painful. He'd never carved anything for anyone. He'd never had anyone to carve for. He'd spent 43 years making sure of that, building a life that required nothing of him, except showing up for work and moving on when the season ended. He'd thought that was freedom, but reading Maria's words about Diego's quiet strength, about the way he'd tried to give his family hope through the work of his hands, Frank began to wonder if he'd just been running from the weight of mattering to someone. The last entry in the journal was dated the same day as the final letter, the 18th of June, 1821. But where the letter had been interrupted mid-sentence, the journal entry was complete. Maria had finished her thought. Diego leaves at dawn to scout the northern route. He says if it is clear, we will move in 3 days. I have packed what little we have left. The children ask me every day when we can go home, and I do not know what to tell them. Tonight I will pray, and I will hold the cross Diego made, and I will try to believe that somewhere there is still a home waiting for us. If we do not survive this journey, if something happens and we cannot return, I pray that whoever finds what we have hidden will understand. We were not rich people, but we were loved. These things represent not just value, but the life we built together, the faith we held, the hope we carried. May they do good in the world. May they be used with care. Frank read the entry 3 times, Maria's words echoing in his mind. We were not rich people, but we were loved. He thought about his own life, the inverse of theirs. He'd never been rich either, but more than that, he'd made sure he was never loved, never needed, never important enough to anyone that his leaving would hurt. The Mendoza family had been torn from the life they'd built. Frank had never built anything, had never stayed anywhere long enough for his absence to create a gap. And now here he sat, in their house, holding their treasures, reading Maria's prayer that these things be used with care. He stood up abruptly, needing air, needing space. Nellie looked up from where she'd been dozing in the corner, sensing his agitation. Frank walked outside, the journal still in his hand, and looked at the landscape around him. Desert stretched in every direction, harsh and beautiful in the late afternoon light. The town of Esperanza Springs was visible in the distance, a small collection of buildings that probably looked much the same as it had in 1821. Had Maria seen this same view? Had she stood where Frank was standing now, watching for dust clouds that might signal danger? Had Diego looked at these same mountains and wondered if they'd ever see their real home again? Frank made a decision. Tomorrow, he'd go into town. He'd go to the library. Esperanza Springs had a small one. He'd passed it a few times and he'd start researching. Not about the treasure's value, but about the Mendoza family. If they'd survived, if they'd made it north, there might be records, birth certificates, census data, death records. Something that would tell him what happened after that last journal entry. He owed them that. Much. Maria had left instructions, after all, clear as day in her final words. May they do good in the world. May they be used with care. Frank wasn't sure he was the right person for that responsibility. He was just an old ranch hand who'd bought a broken house for $1. But Nellie had led him to this treasure, and Maria had left that prayer, and maybe, just maybe, the fact that he'd found it meant something. He went back inside, carefully replaced Maria's journal with the other items, and looked at the cross one more time before slipping it back into his pocket. Tomorrow, he'd start trying to answer Maria's prayer. Tonight, he'd sit with the knowledge that 200 years ago, a family had lived in this house, had loved each other, had hoped for better days, and that somehow, across all those years, their hope had survived in wood and ink and gold hidden in a wall. The Esperanza Springs Public Library occupied half of a building that had once been the town hall. The other half now housed the post office and a community room that rarely got used. Frank had driven past it dozens of times but never gone inside. Libraries were for people with time to read, and Frank had always been too busy working, too busy moving on. The building was old brick, probably from the 1922, with tall windows that would have let in good light when they weren't covered in dust. Frank parked his truck in front and sat for a moment, suddenly nervous. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because this felt like crossing a line, moving from private discovery to public action, from keeping a secret to sharing it. Or maybe because he knew that once he walked in there and started asking questions, the solitary nature of his life here would begin to change. Nellie, secured in the truck bed, let out a low bray. Frank glanced back at her through the rear window. She looked impatient, which was about right for her. Yeah, he muttered, and got out of the truck. The library was cooler. Inside, the air conditioning working hard against the desert heat, bookshelves lined the walls, and a few tables were scattered around the room. Only one person was visible, a woman behind the desk, probably in her early 60s, grey hair pulled back in a neat bun, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up when the door chimed. "Help you?" she asked. Not unfriendly, but not exactly welcoming either. Frank recognized the tone, the one people used with strangers who probably wouldn't amount to much. "I'm looking for local history," Frank said. "Records, maybe. Old census data, that kind of thing." The woman studied him for a moment, reassessing. "History of what, specifically?" "Esperanza Springs. The early days. Around 1821, maybe later." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "That's specific. You doing research?" "Something like that." She stood up, moving with the careful precision of someone whose joints complained but who'd learned to work around the pain. "Rosa Velasco," she said, offering her hand. "I'm the librarian, though that's a fancy title for someone who mostly reshelves books and helps kids with homework. Frank Colton." He shook her hand. Her grip was firm, businesslike. "You're the one who bought the old Morrison place," Rosa said. It wasn't a question. 3 miles out, the stone ruin. "That's right. What made you interested in 1821? Frank hesitated. He hadn't planned what to say, hadn't thought through how much to reveal, but something in Rosa's direct gaze made him decide on honesty. "Found some old documents in the house. Letters. They're dated 1821, written by a family named Mendoza. I'm trying to find out what happened to them." Rosa's expression changed surprise, then genuine interest. "Mendoza? Like Isabella Mendoza?" Frank's heart kicked up a notch. "You know that name?" "There's a photograph in the archive," Rosa said, already moving toward a back room. "Town founding families. Hold on." She disappeared through a doorway, leaving Frank standing among the bookshelves, trying to process what she'd just said. Isabella, that was the daughter's name, the youngest child in Maria's journal. Could it be the same person? Rosa returned carrying a large, flat box. She set it on one of the tables and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, newspaper clippings, and documents, all organized in protective sleeves. She flipped through them with practiced ease until she found what she was looking for. "Here," she said, pulling out a sepia-toned photograph mounted on thick board. "Taken in 1885, according to the note on the back. Town's founding families." Frank leaned in to look. The photograph showed about 30 people arranged in formal rows, dressed in the stiff, formal clothing of the era. The image quality was remarkable for its age. Faces were clear, expressions visible. Rosa pointed to a woman standing in the second row, young, maybe in her 20s, with dark hair and a serious expression. "That's Isabella Mendoza," Rosa said. "According to the records we have, she was one of the original Spanish families in the area. The note says she was a teacher, helped establish the first school." Frank stared at the photograph. Isabella, Maria and Diego's daughter, she'd survived. She'd made it far enough to be photographed in 1885, which meant she would have been, he did the quick math, in her 60s or 70s when this was taken. "She'd lived a full life. What else do you know about her?" Frank asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Rosa pulled out a few more documents. "Not much, honestly. Most of our detailed records start around 1870. Before that it's spotty, but we have some census data." She flipped through pages. "Here, 1870 census. Isabella Mendoza, age 55, listed as a teacher. 1880 census. Same. She's listed as living with a family named Ortega, probably relatives, or she was boarding with them." "What about her parents, brothers?" Rosa shook her head. "That's where it gets unclear. There's no record of other Mendozas in the early census data. It's possible Isabella was the only one who," she paused, tactful, "the only one who made it here, or she could have been related to Mendozas from somewhere else." "When did she die?" Rosa checked through the papers. "Death certificate says 1957. She lived to be 92. Buried in the town cemetery. Never married, no children." The line ended with her. Frank sat down heavily in one of the library chairs. Isabella had made it. The little girl Maria had written about, who'd sung to her doll in hiding. had survived to become a teacher, to help build this town, to live to 92, but she'd been alone. No mention of Miguel or Tomas, no mention of Maria or Diego. "The documents I found," Frank said slowly, "they mention a family. Diego and Maria Mendoza, 3 children, Miguel, Tomas, and Isabella. They were hiding from royalist soldiers in 1821. The last entry was in June of that year. Diego was planning to scout a route north." Rosa sat down across from him, her interest now fully engaged. "You think they were at your house? That they hid there?" "I know they did. Maria kept a journal. She wrote about living there, about teaching the children, about Diego keeping watch. They hid their valuables in the wall, valuable things, old things planning to come back for them. But they didn't come back," Rosa said softly. "No, but Isabella did. Or she ended up here somehow." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of implied tragedy settling between them. Then Rosa stood up. "Let me show you something else." She pulled out another document, this one a handwritten ledger from 1825. "This is from the church records. Sometimes they kept better records than the government did. Look here." Frank leaned in. The entry was dated September 1825 and recorded the arrival of Isabella Mendoza, age 10, orphaned, placed with Ortega family. Orphaned. The word hit Frank like a physical blow. Diego, Maria, Miguel, Tomas, they hadn't made it. Somehow Isabella had survived, but the rest of the family had been lost. The scouting trip Diego had planned, or whatever came after, had taken them. Only the youngest child had lived to carry the family name forward. "You found something significant, didn't you?" Rosa asked gently. "In that house." Frank nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden cross, set it on the table between them. Rosa picked it up carefully, turning it in the light, seeing the detailed carving, the desert flowers, the careful craftsmanship. "Diego made this," Frank said, "for Maria, to help her keep faith." Rosa traced the carved vines with one finger, and Isabella never knew it was there. Never knew her parents had left anything behind. "She thought she had nothing," Frank said. "She lived her whole life thinking she had nothing of theirs. But she had," Frank realized, "hidden in a wall for 2 centuries, waiting. Maria's prayer in the journal, her hope that the treasure would do good in the world she'd never known, that her daughter would spend her life as a teacher, would help build a school, would invest in this community's children." Isabella had honored her mother's wishes without ever knowing what those wishes were. Rosa set the cross down gently. "What are you going to do?" Frank looked at the photograph of Isabella Mendoza, at her serious face and steady gaze. A teacher, a woman who'd lived to 92, who'd given her life to educating children, who'd never married, never had her own family because she'd already lost one. "I don't know yet," Frank said, "but I need to figure it out right." That evening, Frank sat on the front step of his house with Maria's journal open in his lap, though he wasn't reading. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose, and he was thinking about Isabella, 10 years old, orphaned, taken in by strangers. What had that been like? Had she understood what happened to her parents, her brothers? Or had she spent years hoping they'd come back? Nellie wandered over and nudged his shoulder with her nose. Frank reached up absently to scratch behind her ears, his mind still far away. In 1825, imagining a little girl in a town she didn't know, sleeping in a house that wasn't hers, trying to understand why her family was gone. "We're alike, you and me," Frank said to Nellie. "Both orphans. Both ended up with people who didn't have to take us in, but did anyway." Nellie's response was to rest her chin on his shoulder, her way of offering comfort. Frank felt the weight of her head, the warmth of her breath, and thought about all the years they'd spent together. 12 years of companionship, of understanding without words, of presence that demanded nothing except to be acknowledged. He closed the journal and looked at the house behind him. It didn't look like a ruin anymore. Not quite. The roof was solid now. The door hung straight. The windows still needed work, but at least the walls weren't crumbling. He'd done that turned abandonment into something livable, but he'd done it alone, expecting nothing more than a place to die in peace. Now he knew the house's history, knew that a family had hidden here in fear, that they'd left pieces of their hope in these walls, that only one of them had survived. The house wasn't just his shelter anymore. It was a memorial, a testament, a trust placed in someone's hands 200 years too late. Frank pulled the brass compass from his other pocket. He'd found it that afternoon while sorting through the treasure more carefully, preparing to catalogue everything properly. It was beautiful despite its age, the brass tarnished, but the needle still pointing true north. He'd tested it against his own compass, half expecting it to be broken after so long, but it worked perfectly. The inscription on the back was in Spanish, El camino siempre lleva a casa. The path always leads home. Diego's compass, Frank was certain. A merchant would have needed one for travel. And the inscription spoke of a man who believed in return, in completion, in finding your way back to what mattered. Frank turned the compass in his hands, watching the needle adjust, always seeking north no matter how he moved it. He'd never had a home to return to. He deliberately avoided it, moving from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough for any place to claim him. Every path had led away, never back. He'd thought that made him free, but looking at Diego's compass, reading Maria's journals, learning about Isabella's long life, Frank was starting to understand that freedom and rootlessness weren't the same thing. The Mendozas had fought to stay together, to return home. They'd failed, but the fight itself meant something. Isabella had lived her entire life in this town, teaching its children, becoming part of its foundation. She'd chosen to stay, to put down roots, to matter. Frank had chosen the opposite. And here he was at 65, alone except for a donkey, living in a house he'd bought for $1 because it was the only home he could afford and still leave easily. Except he wasn't finding it easy to leave anymore. He'd been thinking about it, loading up the truck, hitting the road again, going somewhere else for the next season. But every time he considered it, something held him back. The weight of the cross in his pocket, the responsibility of the treasure, the knowledge that Rosa knew now that the story wasn't his secret alone anymore, and if he was honest with himself, it wasn't just the treasure keeping him here. It was the way Rosa had looked at the photograph of Isabella with recognition and respect. It was the way she'd handled the cross carefully, understanding immediately that it mattered. It was the fact that, for the first time in 43 years, someone in a town knew his name and used it. He made a decision. Tomorrow, he'd go back to the library. He'd tell Rosa about the town council meeting. In 2 weeks he'd seen a notice for it, posted at the general store. And he'd ask her what she thought about him attending, about maybe speaking up, about possibly doing something with what he'd found. The thought made him nervous in a way that physical danger never had. Fighting weather, dealing with difficult animals. Even that time, he'd been thrown from a horse and broken 3 ribs. None of that had scared him. The way the thought of standing up in front of townspeople and talking scared him. But Maria had left instructions. May they do good in the world. And Isabella had spent her life teaching, investing in community. Maybe this was how Frank could honor both of them. He practiced what he might say, talking quietly to Nellie, who listened with her characteristic patience. "I found something in my house," he began, then stopped. That wasn't right. "There's treasure hidden in my walls." No, that sounded like he was bragging. "I need help figuring out what to do with." That sounded weak. He gave up after a few attempts and just sat there, watching the last light fade from the sky. The stars were coming out, bright and clear in the desert darkness. The same stars the Mendoza family would have seen, hiding in this house, hoping for better days. Frank realized he was thinking of it as the Mendoza house now, not his house. Maybe that was more accurate. He was just a temporary occupant, like they had been. The difference was they'd left something important behind, and he had the chance to do something about it. Nellie shifted beside him, her bell chiming softly. Frank reached over and touched the bell, feeling its smoothness, the dent on one side that had been there when he'd bought her. This bell had been with them through 12 years of wandering. It had marked their presence in dozens of places that Frank couldn't even clearly remember anymore. It was the only constant in his life, besides his own determination to keep moving. "What if we stopped moving?" he asked Nellie. "What if we stayed?" She didn't answer, of course, but she didn't move away either, just stood there solid and warm beside him, present in a way that felt like agreement. Frank looked at the compass again. The path always leads home. Maybe Diego had been wrong about that. Or maybe Frank had just never given any path enough time to lead anywhere except away. The town council meeting was in 2 weeks. He had 2 weeks to decide what to say, what to ask for, what to propose. 2 weeks to figure out how to honor a family he'd never met, in a town that barely knew him, with a fortune he'd found but didn't feel like his. He slipped the compass back into his pocket alongside the cross. 2 artifacts from different purposes, one to mark hope, one to find direction. Frank needed both right now. Tomorrow he'd talk to Rosa. Tonight he'd sit with the decision. He'd made the decision to stop running. At least long enough to see this through. At least long enough to try to do what Maria had asked, even if she'd asked it 200 years too late for her own family to benefit. Maybe that was what home meant, not a place you came from, but a place you finally stopped running from. The town council meeting was held in the same community room that housed half of the library. Frank arrived 15 minutes early, his stomach tight with nerves he hadn't felt since his first day of work on a ranch at age 17. He'd put on his cleanest shirt, the one he saved for the rare occasions he needed to look presentable. The wooden cross and brass compass were both in his pocket, their weight a reminder of why he was doing this. The room filled up quickly. Small towns were like that. Any public meeting was entertainment. Frank recognized some faces from the general store, the diner, the hardware store. Rosa arrived and gave him an encouraging nod, before taking a seat near the front. The mayor, Tom Hendricks, was a weathered man in his 60s who looked like he'd spent his life outdoors. He called the meeting to order with practiced ease. The first half hour was routine business, road repairs, budget discussions, a debate about whether the town could afford to fix the flagpole in the plaza. Frank listened, but didn't really hear. He was trying to figure out when to speak up, what to say, how to explain what he'd found, without sounding like he'd lost his mind. Then Mayor Hendricks looked up from his notes. "Any new business?" This was it. Frank's mouth was dry, his hands were sweating. He stood up, and every eye in the room turned to him. The crazy old cowboy who'd bought the cursed house for $1. He could read their thoughts in their expressions: curiosity, skepticism, a few faces that looked actively hostile. "I'm Frank Colton," he started, his voice rougher than he'd meant it to be. "I know most of you know that already. I'm the one who bought the old Morrison place." A few people nodded, others just stared. "I wanted to tell you about something I found in the house, something that I think belongs to this community, or at least to its history." Now he had their full attention. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden cross. He held it up so people could see it, though from the back of the room it probably just looked like a small piece of wood. "This is a cross, hand-carved, made around 1821 by a man named Diego Mendoza. He was hiding in that house with his wife Maria and their 3 children, running from royalist soldiers during the independence movement. They hid their valuables in a wall, planning to come back for them." He passed the cross to the person nearest him, gesturing for them to pass it around. People leaned in to look at it, and he could see expressions changing from skeptical to curious to engaged. "I found letters," Frank continued, "and a journal. Maria Mendoza wrote about their time in that house, about teaching her children by candlelight, about her husband keeping watch, about hoping they could return home. I found gold coins, silver pieces, religious items, everything they valued, hidden carefully and left behind." A murmur went through the room. Mayor Hendricks leaned forward. "How much are we talking about, Mr. Colton?" "I don't know exactly. 47 gold coins, various denominations, silver pieces, other items. It's valuable, but that's not why I'm here." The cross had made its way to the front of the room. Rosa was holding it now, studying the carved flowers. She looked up at Frank, and her expression told him to keep going. "I've been researching the Mendoza family," Frank said. "With Rosa's help, at the library, we found records, census data, a photograph." He gestured to Rosa, who pulled out a copy of the photograph they'd found, Isabella Mendoza in 1885, standing with other founding families. "That's Isabella Mendoza," Frank said, "Diego and Maria's daughter. She survived and ended up here in Esperanza Springs. She became a teacher. She lived to be 92, died in 1957. But her parents and brothers didn't make it. They died somewhere between 1821 and 1825, and Isabella grew up not knowing that her parents had left anything behind, that they'd hidden these things hoping to reclaim them." The room had gone quiet. People were looking at the photograph now, passing it around with the same care they'd given the cross. "I came here tonight because I don't know what the right thing to do is," Frank admitted. "I found these things, but they don't feel like mine. They were meant for a family that died 200 years ago. They represent hope that never got fulfilled. And I thought—" He paused, trying to organize thoughts he'd rehearsed a dozen times, but which still felt jumbled. "I thought maybe this community should know, should have a say." Mayor Hendricks was nodding slowly. "That's honorable of you, Mr. Colton. Most people would have just kept quiet about a find like that. Most people probably would have the right to," said a voice from the middle of the room. An older man Frank didn't know. "But do you? You bought the house for $1. Does that give you ownership of everything in it?" The question hung in the air. Frank felt his face flush. He'd wondered the same thing but hadn't wanted to voice it. Rosa stood up. "Actually, I've been doing some research on that question." She pulled out a folder Frank hadn't seen before. "I wanted to check the legal history of the property before tonight. And I found something interesting." She moved to the front of the room, spreading papers on the table. "The property, the land and house, has passed through several families since the 1822nd. But I found something in the county records, a document dated 1821, filed by someone named Diego Mendoza." Frank's heart started beating faster. Rosa looked at him, and her expression was complex, part apology, part excitement. "It's a deed of trust," she said. "Legal language is archaic, but the meaning is clear. Diego Mendoza placed the property in trust for the community of Esperanza Springs, to be used for the benefit of its people. It was never formally claimed, never legally voided. According to the county clerk I spoke with, the document is still valid." The room erupted in conversation, people talking over each other, some excited, some skeptical, some confused. Mayor Hendricks called for order, his voice cutting through the noise. "Are you saying," he asked Rosa carefully, "that the property technically belongs to the town? Has all along?" "Not the property itself," Rosa clarified. "That was sold legally multiple times over the years. But anything found on the property that predates those sales, that was placed there by the Mendoza family, yes, I believe it belongs to the community. Or more accurately, it was always meant for the community." Frank sat down heavily, the news hitting him with unexpected force. He'd come here planning to offer the treasure, to suggest it be used for the town's benefit, but Rosa was saying it wasn't his to offer. It had never been his. The Mendoza family had made that decision 200 years ago. A woman near the back stood up. "How do we know this isn't some kind of scam? That he didn't plant this stuff to get attention?" "That's a fair question," Mayor Hendricks said. "Rosa, can this be authenticated?" "Already done," Rosa said. "I took photos of the documents to the county clerk and to a professor at the university who specializes in this period. They both confirmed the deed is authentic, and the dating of the letters and journal is consistent with 1821. The coins can be verified by a numismatist if we want additional confirmation." Frank barely heard the rest of the discussion. He felt strange, lighter somehow, but also emptier. He'd spent a week thinking the treasure was his responsibility, his burden, his decision. Learning it had never been his at all was disorienting. He'd carried the weight of that responsibility, and now it was gone, and he didn't know how to feel about it. The meeting continued around him. Mayor Hendricks suggested forming a committee to investigate further, to verify the legal claims, to determine what should be done. Several people volunteered. Rosa suggested they bring in experts to properly catalogue and assess the treasure. Someone mentioned involving the State Historical Society. Finally, the mayor looked at Frank. "Mr. Colton, I want to thank you for bringing this to our attention. You could have kept quiet, sold the items privately, and nobody would have known. The fact that you came forward says a lot about your character." Frank nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He'd come here tonight expecting to offer something that was his to give. Instead, he'd learned he was just the messenger, the person who happened to be in the right place at the right time, or the wrong place, depending on how you looked at it. People started to disperse, still talking, the energy in the room electric with possibility. Rosa made her way over to Frank, who was still sitting, staring at nothing in particular. "You okay?" she asked. "I don't know," Frank said honestly. I thought this was mine to decide. What to do with it, how to honor the Mendoza family, but it was never mine at all." "No," Rosa agreed. "But you're the one who found it. You're the one who cared enough to research the family, to bring it to the community's attention. That matters." Frank pulled out Diego's compass, looked at the inscription again. "The path always leads home." He'd thought finding the treasure meant something, that it gave him purpose, a reason to stay. But if the treasure wasn't his, what was his reason? "What do I do now?" he asked. Rosa sat down beside him. "You keep helping," she said. "The community will need someone who understands the history, who can speak for the Mendoza family's intentions. You're the one who read Maria's journal, who knows what they hoped for. That knowledge is yours, even if the treasure isn't." Frank considered this. Maybe she was right. The gold and silver belonged to the community by legal decree, but the story, Diego's hope, Maria's faith, Isabella's survival, that was something Frank carried now. That responsibility hadn't disappeared. He looked at Rosa. "The meeting next week. They'll want to decide what to do with it all." "Probably," Rosa said. "Will you come?" Frank thought about loading up his truck, about running the way he'd always run when things got complicated. Then he thought about Isabella, teaching in this town for decades, investing in children who weren't her own because her own family was gone. She'd stayed. She'd built something here. "Yeah," Frank said. "I'll come." The week between meetings felt like the longest of Frank's life. Word had spread through town, faster than a brush fire. The crazy old cowboy had found treasure, and apparently it belonged to everybody. The reactions were split. Some people sought Frank out, shook his hand, thanked him for coming forward. Others avoided him, looked at him with suspicion, or made comments loud enough for him to hear about outsiders and schemes and things that seemed too good to be true. He encountered the worst of it at the general store on Wednesday. Frank was buying coffee and beans, the basic supplies that kept him going, when an old man in a worn ranch coat stepped into his path. "You think we're fools?" the man said, his voice carrying through the store. "You buy a wreck for $1, spend a few weeks alone out there, then suddenly you find treasure that just happens to have legal documents saying it belongs to the town. Mighty convenient." Frank felt every eye in the store turn to him. His first instinct was to push past, to leave, to load up his truck that very night and never come back. But Rosa's words echoed in his mind. "You're the one who knows the story, who can speak for the Mendoza family." "It does seem convenient," Frank agreed, keeping his voice level. "Seemed that way to me too at first. That's why I spent time researching before I said anything." Rosa Velasco verified the documents with the county clerk and a university professor. "You can check with them yourself if you doubt it." "Or you could have faked the whole thing," the man persisted. "Plant some old coins, write some letters, make it all look historical." "I could have," Frank said, "but I didn't. And I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to verify it. The documents are real. The history is real. The Mendoza family lived here. Isabella Mendoza taught in this town for decades. Check the cemetery if you don't believe me, her grave is there. He paid for his supplies and left, his hands shaking with a mix of anger and hurt he hadn't expected to feel. He'd lived his whole life being invisible, being forgettable, being the guy who worked hard and moved on. He'd thought that insulated him from caring what people thought. He was wrong. Nellie was waiting in the truck bed, and when Frank climbed into the cab, she stuck her head through the sliding rear window and nudged his shoulder. He reached back to scratch her ears, taking comfort in her solid, uncomplicated presence. "Some people don't want to believe good things can happen," he told her. "Or maybe they just don't trust strangers. Can't blame them for that, really." But it stung anyway. It stung more because Frank had started to imagine what it might be like to belong here, to be part of something. And the accusation that he was running some kind of con reminded him that he was still an outsider, still the drifter who'd shown up with nothing and probably had no business expecting anything. He drove home, unloaded his supplies, and tried to focus on work. The house still needed repairs. There was always something that needed fixing. But his heart wasn't in it. He kept thinking about the old man's accusations, about the way other people in the store had watched him, some with sympathy but others with the same suspicion. Rosa found him late that afternoon, her sedan pulling up the long drive in a cloud of dust. Frank was replacing boards on the front porch, working mechanically, his mind elsewhere. "I heard about Carl Morrison at the store," Rosa said without preamble. "He's got a mean streak and a suspicious mind. Don't let him get to you." "He said what plenty of others are thinking," Frank replied, not looking up from his work. "Maybe. But plenty of others are excited about what this could mean for the town. For the kids who might get scholarships, for the community center that desperately needs repairs, for the businesses that might get small grants to stay open." Frank set down his hammer and finally looked at her. "I almost left last night. Packed my things, figured I'd move on. That's what I do when things get complicated." "But you didn't leave." "Nellie wouldn't get in the truck," Frank said with a slight smile. "She literally sat down in the driveway and wouldn't move. Stubborn animal." Rosa smiled back. "Smart animal, you mean?" She pulled a small object from her bag, a silver locket on a delicate chain. "I wanted to show you something. I've been doing more research, following leads. I found this in the university archives, donated by a woman who cleaned out Isabella's house after she died." She opened the locket carefully. Inside were two tiny painted portraits, each no bigger than a thumbnail, a woman and a man, formal and serious, done in the miniature style of the early 1800s. "Maria and Diego," Rosa said softly. "Isabella must have had this with her when she came to Esperanza Springs. Maybe her mother gave it to her before whatever happened. She kept it her whole life." Frank stared at the faces in the locket. Maria looked young, maybe in her 20s, with dark eyes and a slight smile. Diego was stern, strong-featured, the kind of face that suggested reliability and determination. These were the people whose words he'd read, whose hopes he'd learned, whose treasure he'd found. Seeing their faces made them real in a way even the letters hadn't. She carried them with her for 82 years, Frank said. "Never forgot them." "No," Rosa agreed. "She didn't, and according to the records, she used her teacher's salary, which wasn't much, to help fund the first school building, to buy books for children whose families couldn't afford them, to support families going through hard times. She gave everything she had to this community." Frank took the locket carefully, looking at the miniature faces. She lived the way her parents would have wanted. Maria wrote in her journal that the treasure should do good in the world. Isabella did that, even without knowing about the treasure. "Which is why the town should honor her family by using it the same way," Rosa said. "That's what I'm going to argue at the meeting. The Mendoza family's legacy was generosity. The treasure should continue that legacy. What are the other options?" Rosa ticked them off on her fingers. "Sell everything and distribute the money equally to all residents. Donate it to the State Historical Society for a museum. Use it to fund the general town budget. or establish a trust fund that generates interest for specific community projects. Which one is likely to win? Hard to say. Depends on who speaks up and how persuasively. There are people who think everyone should get an equal share, probably about $3,000 per person. Others think that's short-sighted, that a community fund would do more good long-term. Frank handed the locket back. What do you think I should do? Tell the truth, Rosa said. Tell them what you learned about the Mendoza family. Read them passages from Maria's journal, if you're willing. Let them hear her voice, her hopes. People respond to stories more than they respond to arguments about money. The thought of reading Maria's words out loud to a room full of people made Frank's stomach clench. But Rosa was right, the story mattered more than the gold. Diego and Maria hadn't hidden those things because they were valuable. They'd hidden them because they represented a life they'd built, a future they'd hoped to reclaim. I'll do it, Frank said. I'll read from the journal. Rosa smiled, and Frank realized she'd become the closest thing to a friend he'd had in years, maybe in his whole life. She believed in him, believed in this, in a way that made him want to believe too. The next few days passed slowly. Frank prepared for the meeting by rereading Maria's journal, marking passages that seemed most important. He practiced speaking them out loud. To Nellie, to the empty house, to the desert air. The words were powerful, made, more so by the knowledge of how the story ended, with everyone but Isabella lost, with hopes unfulfilled, but legacy somehow preserved. He also discovered, while going through the treasure one more time, a piece he'd initially overlooked. It was a small leather pouch, tucked behind the bundle of letters, containing something wrapped in silk. Frank opened it carefully and found another miniature portrait, this one of 3 children arranged together. Miguel, Tomas, and Isabella. They looked happy in the painting, well-dressed, cared for. A family portrait from before everything fell apart. This was what Isabella had lost. Not just parents, but brothers, siblings, her entire family structure. She'd carried the locket with her parents' faces, but had left this portrait behind, probably not even knowing it existed. Frank wondered if seeing it would have comforted her or made the loss unbearable. He decided to bring it to the meeting. Let people see the children's faces, understand what had been lost and what had been found. The night before the meeting, Frank sat on his porch with Nellie beside him, the journal in his lap, watching the sun set over the desert. Tomorrow he'd stand up in front of a room full of people and make his case for honoring a family he'd never met. Some would believe him, some wouldn't. Some would accuse him of manipulation or worse. But he'd do it anyway, because Maria had asked that the treasure do good in the world, and someone needed to be her voice. "We're really doing this," he said to Nellie. "No more running, at least not until this is finished." Nellie's bell chimed softly as she shifted position. Frank took it as agreement, or maybe resignation. With Nellie, it was sometimes hard to tell the difference. He looked at his house, no longer quite so broken, and wondered what would happen after the meeting. If the town voted to establish a community fund, would they ask him to be involved? Would they want an outsider helping make decisions about their treasure? Or would they thank him politely and ask him to step aside, let the people who actually belonged here take it from there? Frank realized he didn't know which outcome he wanted. Part of him still craved the freedom of drifting, of having no responsibilities, of being able to leave whenever things got uncomfortable. But another part, a part that had grown stronger over the past few weeks, wanted to stay, wanted to see this through, wanted to know if the house he'd bought for $1 might become something more than just a place to die quietly. The stars were coming out. The same stars that had shone on Diego and Maria, on Isabella growing up without her family, on generations of people in this town trying to build lives in a harsh landscape. Frank was just one more person passing through their light, just one more temporary presence in a place that had outlasted everyone who'd ever lived in it. But maybe, for once, he could be a presence that mattered. Maybe, for once, he could do something that would last beyond his leaving. Tomorrow he'd find out. The community room was packed beyond capacity. People stood along the walls, sat in folding chairs, brought in from the church, crowded in the doorway. Frank counted at least 70 people, maybe more, nearly 10% of the town's entire population. He sat near the front, Maria's journal in his hands, the miniature portrait of the children in his pocket alongside the cross and compass. Rosa sat beside him, her presence steadying. Mayor Hendricks called the meeting to order, and the conversations died down to an expectant silence. "We're here to discuss the Mendoza treasure," the mayor began. "We've had the documents authenticated by both the county and state historical society. The deed of trust is valid. The treasure, estimated at approximately $275,000, legally belongs to the community under the terms Diego Mendoza set forth in 1821. A murmur went through the crowd, excited, nervous, hopeful. $250,000 was real money, especially for a town that had been dying slowly for decades. "We have 3 main proposals on the table," the mayor continued. "First, donate everything to the State Historical Society for museum preservation. Second, establish a community trust fund that would generate interest for ongoing projects. Third, liquidate the assets and distribute equal shares to all residents, approximately $3,000 per person. We'll hear arguments for each position, then vote." A middle-aged woman stood up, Sally Brennan, who Frank knew owned the struggling diner. "I want to speak for the museum option," she said. "This treasure represents our history, all of our history. It should be preserved properly, studied, displayed where people can learn from it. Not sold off or spent down to nothing." She spoke eloquently about heritage and preservation, about how rare it was to have such a complete historical record, about responsibility to future generations. People nodded, clearly moved. It was a good argument, Frank had to admit. Then a younger man stood. Frank didn't know his name, but he looked to be in his 30s, wearing work clothes. "With respect to Sally, we're a dying town. Young families are leaving because there's no opportunity here. $3,000 per person might not seem like much to some, but for folks struggling to keep their businesses open, for families trying to make ends meet, it could be the difference between staying and leaving. We need to think about the people living here now, not just future generations who might not exist if we all have to move away." This argument also resonated. Frank could see people weighing the options, torn between preservation and immediate need. Rosa stood. "I'd like to speak for the community trust option," she said. Her voice was steady, confident. "A one-time payment of $3,000 will help in the short term, but it won't change the trajectory of this town. A trust fund, properly managed, could provide scholarships for local students every year, fund small business grants, maintain community facilities, and continue indefinitely. It would honor the Mendoza family's legacy of generosity while actually investing in Esperanza Springs' future." She spoke about specific possibilities: repairing the community center, creating an emergency fund for families in crisis, supporting the school, providing health care assistance for elderly residents. Her arguments were practical, forward-looking, grounded in real needs. When she finished, several people nodded in agreement, but others looked skeptical. The equal distribution still had appeal money in hand versus promises of future benefits. Mayor Hendricks looked around the room. "Anyone else want to speak before we vote?" Frank felt Rosa's hand on his arm, encouraging. He stood up, his legs less steady than he'd barred. Like Maria's journal clutched in his hands. "I'm Frank Colton," he said, though everyone knew that by now. "I know some of you think I planted this treasure or I'm running some kind of scam. I can't make you believe otherwise. But I want to read you something." He opened the journal to the passage he'd marked. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice came out clear. "This is from Maria Mendoza's journal, written in June of 1821, the last entry before her family disappeared from history. If we do not survive this journey, if something happens and we cannot return, I pray that whoever finds what we have hidden will understand we were not rich people, but we were loved. These things represent not just value, but the life we built together, the faith we held, the hope we carried. May they do good in the world. May they be used with care. He looked up at the faces watching him. Maria Mendoza left instructions. She asked that the treasure do good in the world. She couldn't have known that only her daughter would survive, that Isabella would spend her life teaching in this town, investing everything she had in educating children and helping families. But Isabella lived out her mother's wishes without even knowing it. Frank pulled out the miniature portrait of the three children. This is Miguel, Tomas, and Isabella. Only Isabella survived. But she chose to spend her life here, giving what little she had to make this community better. The treasure her parents hid should continue what she started, not as a museum piece, not as a one-time windfall, but as an ongoing investment in the people of Esperanza Springs. He sat down, his heart pounding. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Carl Morrison, the old man who'd confronted him at the store, stood up slowly. Carl Morrison's weathered face was unreadable as he looked at Frank. The room held its collective breath, waiting for another accusation, another challenge. Frank braced himself. "I sold Frank that house," Carl said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Sold it for $1 because nobody else wanted it, because I figured it was worthless. I've driven past it a few times these last weeks, watched him working on it alone. Never complained, never asked for help, just fixed what was broken, one piece at a time." He paused, and Frank realized Carl wasn't looking at him with suspicion anymore. A man who honors a broken house will honor broken people too. Frank came forward when he could have kept quiet. He researched the family when he could have just sold the gold. And now he's standing here asking us to do right by people who've been dead for 200 years. Carl's voice grew stronger. "That's not a scam. That's character. And I was wrong to suggest otherwise." Frank felt something release in his chest. Carl walked over to him and held out his hand. Frank shook it, seeing sincerity in the old man's eyes. "I'm voting for the community trust," Carl said. "Not because I don't need $3,000, I do, but because Frank's right. Isabella Mendoza gave her whole life to this town. The least we can do is honor that." He sat down, and for a moment no one spoke. Then Sally Brennan stood up again. "Carl Morrison just admitted he was wrong about something. That might be the real miracle here." A few people laughed, breaking the tension. "I'm changing my vote. Community trust." One by one, other people stood to speak. A grandmother talked about her grandson needing help with college. A business owner mentioned how a small grant could save his hardware store. A young mother described the need for better childcare options. The conversation shifted from abstract arguments to concrete hopes, to what the treasure could actually do for real people in real situations. Mayor Hendricks finally called for order. "All right, we need to vote, but first I want to establish something. If the community trust wins, we'll need a board to manage it, to make decisions about fund distribution and investments. We should decide on that now. I nominate Rosa Velasco," someone called out. Agreement rippled through the room. "I nominate Carl Morrison," someone else said. "Sally Brennan. Tom Hendricks." Names were called, discussed, voted on. Within 20 minutes, they had a 5-person board, all respected community members. Then Mayor Hendricks looked at Frank. "One more nomination. I'd like Frank Colton to serve on the board." The room went quiet again. Frank's mouth opened, but no words came out. Serve on the board? He was the outsider, the drifter, the man who'd bought a house for $1 just to have somewhere to die. "He's not even really from here," someone protested, but the voice was half-hearted. "He's the one who knows the Mendoza family story," Rosa said firmly. "He's the one who can speak to their intentions, help us honor their legacy properly, and he's proven he cares more about doing right by this community than about personal gain." "All in favor of Frank Colton serving on the trust board?" Mayor Hendricks asked. Hands went up across the room. Not everyone. Frank could see faces that still looked skeptical, people who'd probably never fully trust him. But enough, more than enough. "Motion carries," the mayor said. "Now, let's vote on how to use the treasure." They used paper ballots, marked in private, deposited in an old wooden box that the mayor explained had been used for community votes since 1889. The same box, Frank realized, that had probably been used when Diego Mendoza's deed of trust was originally acknowledged by the town. The same box that had made decisions about this community for over a century. The counting took 30 minutes. Frank sat with Rosa, not talking, just waiting. His shirt pocket felt heavy with the weight of the cross, the compass, the portrait of the children. Whether the vote went his way or not, he'd done what Maria had asked. He'd tried to make sure the treasure did good in the world. Finally, Mayor Hendricks stood with the tally sheet. Museum option, 18 votes. Equal distribution, 31 votes. Community trust, 48 votes. The room erupted in applause, though not everyone was clapping. 48 was a majority, but not an overwhelming one. There were people who'd wanted that $3,000, who needed it, who were disappointed. Frank saw that in their faces and understood it. He'd been poor his whole life. He knew what a difference $3,000 could make, but he also knew what a difference $275,000 could make to a whole community over years and decades. Scholarships for kids like Isabella Mendoza must have been. Help for families struggling the way the Mendoza family had struggled. Investment in a future that honored the past. Mayor Hendricks continued talking about next steps, establishing the trust legally, bringing in financial advisors, setting up the first board meeting. Frank heard the words but didn't quite process them. He was looking at the faces around the room, seeing hope mixed with skepticism, excitement mixed with doubt, possibility mixed with fear. Carl Morrison caught his eye and nodded. Rosa squeezed his arm, and Frank realized that, for the first time in 65 years, he was part of something that might actually last. 3 months later, Frank stood in his house and barely recognized it. The roof was fully repaired, solid and weathertight. The windows had glass in them, the floors were level. The walls had been cleaned and stabilized, preserving their historical character while making them safe. One of the smaller rooms had been converted into a display space for the Mendoza artifacts, not all of them, just enough to tell the story. The rest were in a bank vault, awaiting decisions from the trust board about which items to sell and which to preserve. The transformation hadn't been Frank's work alone. After the vote, people from town had started showing up, bringing tools, offering skills, contributing labor. The house had become a community project, a symbol of what the Mendoza treasure represented. Frank had protested at first, uncomfortable with the attention, but Carl Morrison had shut that down quickly. "You helped us," Carl had said. "Let us help you." So Frank had learned to accept help, which was harder than he'd expected. He'd spent 43 years being self-sufficient, needing nothing from anyone. Learning to say yes when someone offered assistance, learning to work alongside others instead of alone, it required a different kind of strength. The community center had been the first project funded by the trust. New roof, updated facilities, a proper heating and cooling system. It had reopened last week with a celebration that drew nearly the entire town. Frank had been there, uncomfortable with the attention, but unable to deny that seeing people gather in a space made safe and comfortable by the Mendoza treasure felt right. The scholarship fund was next. They'd awarded the first one to Rosa's niece, $15,000 toward her college education, renewable if she maintained her grades. The girl had cried when they told her. So had Rosa. So had Frank, though he'd turned away so no one would see. Small business grants were being distributed next month. The hardware store would get updated inventory systems. Sally's Diner would get new kitchen equipment. A young couple who wanted to open a bookstore in a town of 847 people would get startup funding. Not every business would make it, but they'd have a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. Frank served on the trust board, attending meetings twice a month, helping make decisions about fund allocation. He'd been surprised to discover he had useful insights, that his lifetime of practical work gave him perspective on what projects were feasible and which were pipe dreams. Rosa had smiled when he'd mentioned this, as if she'd known all along. Nellie had a new bell now, cast from a small portion of the silver they'd liquidated. It was engraved with both Frank's name and the Mendoza family crest, a gesture from the town that had brought Frank to tears when Carl Morrison presented it to him. The old bell was displayed alongside the Mendoza artifacts, a symbol of continuity between past and present. Frank walked through his house in the late afternoon light, running his hand along walls that had stood for 200 years. They'd seen so much, the Mendoza family's fear and hope, decades of abandonment and now revival. The stones felt warm under his palm, solid, enduring. He stopped in the display room and looked at the items arranged carefully in cases Rosa had helped him install. Maria's journal was open to the final entry, protected behind glass. The wooden cross Diego had carved sat on a small pedestal. The miniature portrait of the children was mounted on the wall, and beside it a photograph from 1885, Isabella Mendoza, the survivor, the teacher, the woman who'd built a life from loss. Below the photograph was a new plaque, bronze, commissioned by the trust board. It read, Familia Mendoza, Diego, Maria, Miguel, Tomas and Isabella. Their trust was not misplaced. Frank had suggested the inscription, pulling it from the deed of trust Diego had filed. The board had agreed unanimously. It felt right, acknowledging that Diego's faith in the community had been vindicated, even if it had taken 2 centuries. A sound outside pulled Frank from his thoughts, cars pulling up, voices, footsteps. He glanced out the window and saw people arriving for the memorial dedication. They were planting a garden in the front yard, desert plants chosen for their resilience and beauty, the same plants Diego had carved into the wooden cross. Frank reached into his pocket out of habit, but the cross wasn't there anymore. It was in the display case, where it belonged, where people could see it and understand what it represented. His pocket felt empty without it, but he'd learned to carry its meaning instead of its physical weight. Rosa appeared in the doorway. "You ready? Everyone's waiting." Frank nodded. He followed her outside, where 30 or 40 people had gathered. Mayor Hendricks was there, and Carl Morrison and Sally Brennan, the young mother whose son would receive childcare assistance, the grandmother whose grandson would get scholarship support. Familiar faces now, people who knew his name and used it. The ceremony was simple. Mayor Hendricks spoke about the Mendoza family, about Isabella's life of service, about how the treasure was fulfilling Maria's prayer that it do good in the world. Rosa read passages from the journal, her voice steady and clear. Carl Morrison talked about community, about trust, about how strangers sometimes became family if you let them. Then they unveiled the garden marker, a simple stone with the Mendoza name and dates, surrounded by the plants Diego had loved enough to carve. People placed flowers, stood in quiet reflection, spoke softly to each other about history and hope. Frank stood apart slightly, watching. Nellie ambled over and rested her head against his shoulder, her new bell chiming softly. He scratched behind her ears and thought about paths and homes and all the places he'd run from in 65 years. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, the same colors Frank had seen hundreds of times in hundreds of places. But tonight they looked different. Tonight they looked like they were illuminating something that mattered, something that would last beyond his leaving. Except he wasn't planning to leave. Not this time. Rosa came to stand beside him as the ceremony ended and people began to disperse. "You did good," she said. "Maria did good," Frank corrected. "I just found what she left behind." "No," Rosa said. "You chose what to do with it. You could have sold it quietly, moved on, kept running, but you didn't. You stopped. You stayed." Frank looked at his house. No longer crumbling, no longer empty. He looked at the memorial garden, at the people talking quietly in his front yard, at the community that had formed around a discovery he'd almost run from. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess I did." The last light faded from the sky, and the stars came out, the same stars that had shone on Diego carving his cross by candlelight, on Maria writing her prayers in a journal, on Isabella building a life from grief. The same stars that had watched Frank drift for 43 years, never staying, never belonging. He was 65 years old. He had a house that was truly his, even if he'd only paid $1 for it. He had a purpose that extended beyond the next paycheck. He had people who knew his name and cared whether he stayed or left. He had Nellie, her new bell chiming softly in the evening air. Some men spend their whole lives searching for home. Frank Colton had finally stopped running long enough to find his. He put his arm around Rosa's shoulders, a gesture of friendship that felt natural now, and together they walked back toward the house. Nellie followed, her bell marking each step with a clear, bright note that echoed off the stone walls. Inside, the display cases gleamed in the lamplight. Outside, the memorial garden would bloom in spring. And somewhere, Frank hoped, Maria and Diego Mendoza knew their faith had not been misplaced, that their treasure was doing exactly what they'd prayed it would do, making good in the world. Used with care. Honored by strangers who'd become family, in a house bought for $1 that had become priceless.